Some films were not meant to disappear, but they almost did. Not because they failed, but because they disturbed the system that released them. Studios cut them, hid them, pulled them back when the pressure became too intense. These are not just controversial movies, these are films that were nearly erased. And as we count down the list, the truth behind each one becomes harder to ignore. Number 10, Pink Flamingos, 1972. There was no polite way to release this film, no safe audience, no marketing strategy that could disguise what it really was. When John Waters finished Pink Flamingos, studios did not just hesitate, they refused. The content crossed lines that even exploitation cinema rarely approached. This was not shock for entertainment. This was confrontation designed to make viewers uncomfortable in ways mainstream cinema avoided. The result was immediate isolation. No major distributor wanted the risk. The film was pushed out of the traditional system and forced into midnight screenings where audiences came prepared for something dangerous. That environment became its survival mechanism, not because studios supported it, but because they wanted distance from it. The more controversial the film became, the more it was treated like something that needed containment rather than promotion. What makes this case important is not just the content, but the reaction from the industry. Instead of trying to reshape it or soften it, studios simply stepped away. That is a form of burial that does not look like censorship on paper but functions the same way in reality. A film without access to wide distribution might as well not exist to the general public. Over time, the strategy failed. Audiences who discovered it turned it into a legend. Word of mouth did what marketing refused to do. What began as a film that studios wanted to ignore slowly became one of the most infamous cult classics ever made. Number 9, Peeping Tom, 1960. The damage happened quickly, too quickly for recovery. When Peeping Tom arrived, it was not just rejected, it was attacked. Critics reacted with hostility that bordered on moral outrage. The film did not just disturb them, it offended their expectations of what cinema should be. That reaction triggered a chain response that studios could not control but chose not to resist. Michael Powell had been respected before this moment. After this film, his career collapsed almost overnight. Distributors pulled back, the industry closed its doors, the film itself disappeared from circulation, not because of official bans, but because no one wanted to be associated with it. That is a quieter form of burial, but just as effective. What made it so threatening was its perspective. It forced the audience into the mind of a killer and made them complicit in the act of watching. That psychological discomfort was too much for the time. Studios did not defend it. They allowed the backlash to erase it. Years later, the film returned and critics reconsidered it. What was once labeled unacceptable became recognized as groundbreaking, but that does not erase what happened. For years, it existed in silence, a film that was not allowed to live in its own time. Number 8, The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. Before a single frame reached most audiences, the narrative had already been decided. Not by critics, not by viewers, but by outrage. The Last Temptation of Christ became a target long before release, and that pressure shaped everything that followed. Religious groups organized protests across multiple countries. The reaction was not quiet disagreement. It was loud public resistance that escalated into threats against theaters. Universal Pictures found itself in a position where distribution became a risk calculation rather than a creative decision. Screenings were canceled. Some theaters refused to show it entirely. In several regions, the film was effectively erased before it had a chance to exist. That is what makes this case so significant. The suppression happened in real time, not after failure, not after rejection, before audiences could even decide for themselves. Martin Scorsese intended a deeply human exploration of faith and doubt. But that intention was overshadowed by the storm around it. The film was reduced to controversy in headlines and debates, while its actual content remained unseen by many who judged it. What remains fascinating is how the strategy backfired. The attempt to limit exposure turned the film into something people sought out with curiosity and defiance. Over time, it gained recognition not as a scandal, but as a serious work of cinema. But that later respect does not erase the reality of its release. A major studio stepped back under pressure and allowed fear to dictate visibility. Number 7, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. It felt too real. That was the problem. When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre began circulating, it did not resemble the polished horror audiences were used to. It looked raw, almost documentary like, and that illusion of reality created a level of discomfort that distributors did not know how to handle. Tobe Hooper had crafted something relentless. The violence was not stylized, it was abrupt and chaotic. That intensity triggered immediate backlash. Authorities in multiple countries banned the film outright. In others, it faced heavy restrictions that limited where and how it could be shown. Studios reacted by distancing themselves, not openly condemning it, but quietly stepping away. Distribution became fragmented. Instead of a wide, coordinated release, the film moved through isolated channels. Each restriction reduced its reach. Each hesitation reinforced the idea that this was something to be contained rather than promoted. And yet containment failed. Audiences who encountered it carried the experience with them. They talked about it, they warned others, they recommended it in whispers. That underground momentum turned the film into a phenomenon that no official campaign could have achieved. What was meant to be suppressed became unavoidable. The very qualities that made studios uncomfortable became the reason it endured. Number 6, Cruising, 1980. The conflict began before the film was even finished. While Cruising was still in production, the streets around it turned hostile. Protesters gathered, noise was used to disrupt filming. Entire scenes had to be reworked or abandoned. This was not just controversy after release. This was resistance embedded into the creation itself. William Friedkin pushed forward with a vision that was already under scrutiny. By the time the film reached the studio stage, it carried a reputation that made executives uneasy. Warner Brothers responded by tightening control. Cuts were demanded. Entire sequences were removed. What audiences eventually saw was not the original film, but a compromised version shaped by pressure from multiple directions. The marketing reflected that discomfort. Promotion avoided clarity. The studio did not lean into the film's identity. Instead, it tried to soften perception while still releasing it. That hesitation created confusion and suspicion. People were not just reacting to the film, they were reacting to everything surrounding it. Perhaps the most telling detail is what is missing. Reports of deleted footage continue to circulate. Scenes that were considered too controversial were removed permanently. That absence turned into part of the film's mythology. What was taken out became just as important as what remained. Over time, Cruising has been reassessed with a more nuanced lens. But its original release stands as a clear example of a studio attempting to control damage rather than support a filmmaker. The film survived, but only after being reshaped into something safer. And even then, the shadow of what it once was never disappeared. Number 5, Straw Dogs, 1971. It was not the violence alone that unsettled audiences. It was the way that violence felt inevitable. When Straw Dogs arrived, it forced viewers into a moral space they did not want to occupy. It did not offer comfort. It did not provide distance. Instead, it asked difficult questions about human nature and aggression that lingered long after the film ended. Sam Peckinpah had already built a reputation for pushing boundaries, but this film went further. The controversy surrounding its content quickly attracted attention from censors and regulators. Demands for cuts followed. In several countries, the film faced outright bans. In others, it was released in heavily edited form that reduced its impact. Studios found themselves balancing risk against visibility. The safest approach was limitation. Screenings were restricted. Distribution was uneven. The film existed, but it was not allowed to fully enter the mainstream conversation. That kind of partial suppression is difficult to quantify, but easy to feel. A film that should have sparked wide debate instead moved quietly through fragmented releases. The reaction revealed a deeper discomfort. This was not just about what was shown on screen, it was about what the film implied. That violence was not external, that it could emerge from within ordinary people under pressure. That idea was more unsettling than any single scene. In later years, Straw Dogs gained recognition as a powerful and complex work. Critics revisited it with a different perspective. But the history of its release tells a more complicated story. A film that challenged audiences so directly that institutions responded by limiting its reach. Not destroying it outright, but ensuring it never had full freedom in its own time. Number 4, Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. There are films that provoke outrage, and then there are films that provoke rejection at a systemic level. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, did not simply divide audiences. It triggered a coordinated response that pushed it out of normal circulation almost immediately. From its earliest screenings, the reaction was not debate. It was refusal. Governments banned it. Authorities seized prints. In some countries, it was treated not as art, but as something that should not exist in public view at all. Pier Paolo Pasolini constructed the film as a political statement wrapped in extreme imagery. That combination proved impossible for institutions to tolerate. Distributors hesitated. Exhibitors backed away. Even where it was technically legal, it often remained inaccessible because no one wanted to take responsibility for showing it. Yeah, that is where suppression becomes invisible. The absence of formal bans in some regions did not mean availability, it meant avoidance. Studios and mainstream distributors did not attempt to integrate it into the cinematic landscape. They treated it as something separate, something to be isolated rather than contextualized. That decision ensured that the film existed on the margins where only determined viewers could find it. Access required effort. Curiosity had to overcome barriers. What makes this case especially significant is how persistent the suppression remained. Decades passed and the film still carried restrictions. Versions were cut, releases were limited. The idea of a complete and widely available presentation remained elusive. That ongoing control reinforced its reputation as a film that the system could not comfortably contain. And yet that very resistance shaped its legacy. The more it was restricted, the more it became a symbol of forbidden cinema, a work that existed not just for what it showed, but for the reaction it provoked. It was not buried in the traditional sense. It was pushed to the edges and kept there, and from those edges, it continued to exert influence in a way few films ever do. Number 3, The Devils, 1971. Few films illustrate the mechanics of suppression as clearly as The Devils. This was not a case of quiet limitation or passive neglect. This was active intervention. From the moment it was completed, the film became a problem that needed to be managed. The controversy surrounding its religious themes did not fade with time. It intensified. And that escalation forced Warner Brothers into a defensive position. Ken Russell delivered a work that was unapologetically confrontational. The imagery was bold. The narrative was provocative. Instead of standing behind it, the studio chose control. Cuts were implemented, scenes were removed, different versions began to circulate, each one reflecting a compromise rather than the original vision. The film did not exist as a stable text. It existed as a series of altered forms shaped by external pressure. What followed was even more telling. The complete version became difficult to access. Not temporarily, persistently. Over the years, attempts to restore and release the uncut film faced obstacles that reinforced its status as something partially hidden. This was not just about initial controversy, it was about long-term containment. The strategy reveals a particular kind of institutional response. When a film cannot be easily defended, it is reshaped until it becomes less threatening. When that is not enough, it is restricted. Visibility becomes selective. Availability becomes conditional. The audience does not encounter the film as it was intended. They encounter a version that has been negotiated into existence. And yet, the reputation of The Devils continued to grow. The knowledge that something was missing created its own form of intrigue. Viewers were not just watching a film, they were searching for what had been taken away. That search became part of its identity. In the end, the film stands as both a work of cinema and a case study in suppression, not erased, not entirely banned, but altered and constrained in ways that ensured it could never fully exist in the open. Number 2, Freaks, 1932. The shock was immediate, not gradual, not evolving, instant. When Freaks was first shown to test audiences, the reaction was so intense that it forced Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer into emergency mode. Reports described viewers leaving theaters in distress. Some were outraged, others were simply unsettled in a way that traditional cinema had never caused before. This was not the kind of attention a major studio wanted. Todd Browning had created something radically different. Instead of presenting spectacle at a safe distance, he brought it directly into the narrative with a level of humanity that audiences were not prepared to confront. That decision transformed curiosity into discomfort. The studio responded by cutting the film aggressively. Entire sequences were removed. The tone was softened, the structure was altered. What remained was only a partial reflection of the original vision. But the cuts were only the beginning. Distribution was limited. In some regions, the film was banned outright. In others, it was shown briefly and then withdrawn. The message was clear. This was not a product the studio felt comfortable supporting. It was something to be contained, something to be minimized. What makes this case particularly revealing is how quickly the industry turned away from it. The same system that had produced the film chose to distance itself almost immediately. Promotion disappeared. The film faded from public view. For years, it existed in a kind of cinematic shadow where access was rare and fragmented. And yet time changed everything. Decades later, the film was rediscovered and reevaluated. What had once been rejected as unacceptable began to be recognized for its boldness and emotional depth. But that later appreciation cannot erase the original reaction. Freaks was not simply controversial, it was treated as something that should not be widely seen. Its journey from suppression to recognition reveals the tension between artistic risk and institutional control. A film that dared to challenge norms was met with resistance so strong that it nearly vanished. And the fact that it survived at all speaks less about the system that tried to bury it and more about the enduring power of what it dared to show. Number 1, A Clockwork Orange, 1971. The film did not just spark controversy, it ignited a cultural firestorm that refused to settle. When A Clockwork Orange was released, it quickly became the center of a growing debate about violence and its influence. Reports of real-world incidents allegedly linked to the film began to circulate. Media coverage intensified. Public concern escalated. The conversation shifted from cinema to responsibility. Stanley Kubrick found himself at the center of that storm. The pressure was not abstract, it was personal. Threats were reported. The situation reached a point where continuing normal distribution in the United Kingdom no longer seemed viable. The response was unprecedented. Kubrick requested the withdrawal of the film from UK circulation, and the studio complied. A major motion picture was effectively removed from an entire country, not by government order, but by decision. This is what sets this case apart. It was not a ban in the traditional sense, it was a disappearance. The film continued to exist internationally, but in the UK it became inaccessible for decades. That absence created a void that only increased its mystique. People talked about it, remembered it, sought it out through unofficial means. The attempt to reduce its influence had the opposite effect. What makes the situation even more complex is the film itself. It was not simply violent, it was analytical. It explored control, free will, the consequences of conditioning. Those themes became entangled with the controversy surrounding it. The discussion moved beyond the screen and into society. When the film finally returned to UK audiences years later, it carried the weight of its absence. It was no longer just a film, it was an event. A work that had been withheld and then restored. In the end, A Clockwork Orange stands as the clearest example of how far suppression can go without formal prohibition. A film removed not because it failed, but because it provoked too much. And in trying to contain it, the system ensured it would never be forgotten. They tried to bury these films, but the silence never lasted. Controversy became their survival. Suppression became their legend. If this changed how you see cinema history, then stay with us because there are more stories hidden just beneath the surface waiting to be uncovered.